in Woodstock, New York, coming down in 3, 2, 1. Check 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Spectrum 1, 2, 3. Okay. All right. Okay, 21st of July, 1998. Interviews with Richard Bell and Jimmy Weider here in Woodstock. Where's the thing for them to read first? Start with that, if you would, Richard. Hi, this is Richard. You could be Richard Newell. No, it's a Neville.
Hi, this is Richard Bell of the Neville Brothers.
No, Richard Bell of the band, or Richard Bell.
Hi, this is Richard Bell of the band. You're listening to Spectrum with Thomas Grooms on 105.9 WJZW.
Hello, this is Jim Weider of the band. You're listening to Spectrum with Thomas Grooms on 105.9 WJZW.
You're listening to Spectrum on 105.9 WJZW, Woodbridge, Washington. Good morning, I'm Thomas Grooms, and joining us this morning, a rare treat, Jim Weider, lead guitarist with the legendary band, and Richard Bell is with us, also from the band. Gentlemen, good morning, welcome to Spectrum.
Good morning.
Morning.
When you think of the band, you think of unrestricted creativity, freedom of expression. This has always been the way it has been for you, hasn't it?
Oh yeah, we can just kind of do what we feel, you know, and put our part in the music. Right, Rich?
Absolutely.
We're doing the show this morning from the Catskill Mountains in beautiful Woodstock, New York. This was the backdrop for the famous novel by James Fenimore Cooper, The Last of the Mohicans.
I believe so. Also, Rip Van Winkle fell asleep up here, I think, for a while.
Yeah, I tried to find him when I was a kid. I climbed up the mountain and looked for Rip, but must have been in a cave somewhere.
You had those baggies on your shoes?
I don't know about that one, Rich. That was the 60s. I can't remember much from that.
And then I think 500,000 people came looking for him in 1969, and at that concert it was the famous Woodstock Music and Arts Festival that to this day lives on. The band played at that show the first time. They didn't videotape it because of creative reasons. They didn't feel the performance was good enough. However, you have joined the band on the second leg since 1985. I think I met you in about 84. You were fortunate enough to play with the band as well as Richard in 1994. How was that experience?
That was great. It was pretty wild. A lot of people, a lot of mud.
A lot of rain. But it was enjoyable. Yeah. Well, I have a sort of a slightly different outlook because just as I was getting on stage, it had poured and they'd had like a canvas roof on top of the stage, and the water had all accumulated directly above the piano, and we weren't using like an acoustic piano. We're using one of those electronic types. So just as I got on, the canvas collapsed. The water hit it. Fortunately, it didn't hit me and wreck my beautiful hairdo, but it did mess with the keyboard.
You're listening to Spectrum. If you just joined us, our guest this morning from the legendary band, Jim Weider, and also with us, Richard Bell. And Richard, people may know, they may not know, that you are no stranger to the music industry. You, of course, have been at it since the 60s. You were an intricate part of Janis Joplin's change before her passing when she left Big Brother and the holding company and started the full Tilt Boogie Band.
That's correct. We were based in San Francisco, and after Janis passed over, because her manager was Albert Grossman, who at that time lived here, so he suggested that the band move here, so we moved here. I think I lived here for about 10 years. At Woodstock's heyday, during that time, there were so many artists, from Van Morrison to the band, of course, Bob Dylan, Paul Butterfield, many artists, and it was a great time because there was a lot jamming. Every night you could go someplace and say, hey, they're playing music over here, and you go over and play all night. And, well, like with anything, any good thing has to come to an end, so it slowly faded out. And Jim and I, well, we hooked up. We'd known each other here and we'd played here, but we hooked up in Los Angeles and moved to Atlanta and had a good time down there.
Jim, you are a product of the Woodstock community. You were born and raised here. And this morning we're going to talk about your new project also. You have a new CD out, a solo effort, which Richard is included on, as well as Randy from the band Bigfoot. Richard has been with you since the beginning of this project. So has Randy. And the band is Jim Weider and the Honky Tonk Gurus.
Yes. We're out playing now, and we're starting to play up the East Coast, and we're looking forward to coming down to your area, down to D.C. Hopefully soon.
Well, we're going to let you guys play disc jockey this morning. The audience, I'm sure, is going to be in for a real treat. What we're going to do is play something from Jim Weider and the Honky Tonk Gurus, and what we have queued up is a couple of things. We have the tune Sliding Home, and also we're going to play a vocal off of this, as well as Deepest Cut. What would you like to play first?
I'll leave that one up to you. Whatever you decide.
Okay, let's play Deepest Cut from Jim Weider and the Honky Tonk Gurus, and then we'll come back and talk some more, okay?
Good. That's a good one to do.
You're listening to Spectrum on 105.9 WJZW. That was David Sanborn, Blue Beach, and also we heard from Jim Weider and the Honky Tonk Gurus, Deepest Cut. Now, David Sanborn is no stranger to the Woodstock area, is he?
Oh, yeah. I used to go and see him play when he was just developing his style here. He used to tear up the clubs, right, Richard? I mean, he'd play in the Joyous Lake, and there was another club, the Sled Hill. He had a band with Buzzy Featon and Neil Larson called Full Moon in the 60s, and they were doing stuff way ahead of their time. He would kind of play like, I always thought he played in fours intervals across the neck, like McCoy Tyner. Neil Larson played like that, and so did Buzzy. Like really into pentatonic scales, and developing their own style. They all three kind of played a lot alike, and they really forged new ground, but Sanborn was great.
I realize now, not then, but back in 1969, he was with Butterfield and that blues band, and you were here.
Yes, I think it predated. It was a full horn section band, and I think it predated Better Days. I'm trying to think of some of the other horn players that were in it. Gene Dinwiddie, Trevor Lawrence. I think that might have been it. Wasn't that three? And then Buzzy played guitar, and Billy, bass player, and that's where they found also Philip Wilson. So Philip Wilson was the drummer, and he became part of Full Moon along with David Sanborn.
And when I mentioned to Jim earlier about the band first playing in '69 and not being in the film or the movie Woodstock, Janis also played and wasn't included the first time, but yet she was in the second time, right?
Right, that's correct. I wasn't playing with Janis at that time, but I've known the original members of the band way back, way in the early 60s, because, of course, 4 of them had come from Canada, which I also am from, and we'd all played with a fellow named Ronnie Hawkins up there. So working with Ronnie is sort of like belonging to the same secret society or something. You know, if you meet somebody who's played with Hawkins, it's you share a lot of common interests, because Ronnie is a unique personality unto himself.
With us this morning, Richard Bell and Jim Weider from the legendary band. We're coming to you from Woodstock, New York, in the Catskill Mountains, and you mentioned Ronnie Hawkins. You think of rock and roll because that was the beginning of rock and roll. Elvis, rockabilly was all during the 50s. Ronnie Hawkins stands for rockabilly. And Jim, you've kept the tradition alive. You're playing a 54 Telecaster.
Oh yeah, 53, 52, and a 54. All my favorites. They really get that to me is, I've always played Telecaster, and it just has that tone, you know. And I was influenced by Roy Buchanan, who is from your area, and once I heard him playing a 50s, I had to have one of those, because I went on search for that great tone, you know, and those old 50s ones have it, you know. And Roy sure was he's Mr. Telecaster to me. There's nobody better who got the sound and feeling out of the guitar like Roy Buchanan. So he was a big influence.
Well, the buzz on the street now is that you're the next Roy Buchanan.
Well, I don't think I could ever accept that, but that's awfully nice of people to say, you know.
And this
live up to.
And this community has always spawned many types of music, as we're talking about jazz, rock and roll, blues.
Well, I was just going to add to Telecaster players. I don't play guitar myself, but it strikes me. They're electric guitars, and each one, of course, has its own personality. But it seems to me that there's certain people who are just born to play that particular guitar. I've heard other guitarists who will pick one up, and they don't have. I mean, they can play the same licks that they play, but it just doesn't sound the same. And Jim is one of those people in my mind was born with a Telecaster in his hand. Maybe it was like a little dwarf Telecaster, though. That never can tell.
You're listening to Spectrum. With us this morning, Jim Weider and Richard Bell from the band. And we're up here in Woodstock, New York. The environment here in Woodstock, a lot of work has gone into it over the past 2.5, 3 decades. The Hudson Valley, you've cleaned up the Hudson River.
Yeah, it's changed a lot. I mean, well, there's no more tree huts with hippies in it anymore. It's, you know, it's kind of like lawyers and doctors and boutique shops, but there's still some great musicians here in the woods living up here. And it's a great place to live and work out of and go on the road from here, you know. But there's some amazing amount of great musicians. I was lucky enough to have, on like that tune "I'm in Love," Dave Sanchez, who's a great pianist who sat in, and Tony Levin, who played on Sliding Home on bass, and Garth Hudson lives here, of course, and we had a lot of nice help from some good friends great musicians that live in the valley here.
David, of course, from the early days with Bruce Springsteen.
Right, Bruce Springsteen, and God, who else did he play with? Sting for years, too.
Well, why don't we fire that up? That's a great song, "I'm in Love." Is there a story behind it before we play it?
I've always liked the song, and I've had all these tracks that me and Richard and Randy cut like over the last 5 or 6 years now that were sitting in the can, and I said, we got to get this out, and I decided, I've always liked that tune, so I decided to finish the record I would work it up, and I got a hold of, I did the track, and then I had to find somebody to sing it, and I had my friend, our friend Ernie Cate, called him up down in Arkansas from the Cate Brothers, who's just one of the best white soul singers I've ever heard. And he lives down in Arkansas, and we sent the tapes down, and he sent it back. First take, it's just a great performance, you know, a really good performance.
Here's Jim Weider and the Honky Tonk Gurus, "I'm in Love" on Smooth Jazz 105.9. You're listening to Spectrum on 105.9 WJZW, and we just heard from Jim Weider and the Honky Tonk Gurus. Also, we heard from David Sanborn once again, and "Georgia on My Mind" does a great version of that. And I believe Richard Manuel used to sing that song with the old band, didn't he?
Yeah, we used to play that tune, and Richard could sing the heck out of it, you know. Ray Charles was a big influence on Richard Manuel, and when he'd sing that, you could hear it in his voice, you know.
Speaking of the just rich musical community that you have here in Woodstock, I was looking at a poster. David Fathead Newman's playing. Warren Bernhardt, one of our artists, is playing for a jazz festival.
Great. Warren Bernhardt's fantastic, right, Rich?
Excellent keyboard. You know, excellent keyboardist.
Who are some of your influences, Richard?
Well, Otis Spann from Muddy Waters Band was my first. I grew up with blues primarily. Johnny Johnson, Fats Waller, Little known pianist Lloyd Glenn, like him a lot. Yeah, I realized a long time ago there was somebody that really impressed me. I'd listen to, and then the next thing I'd say, well, they must have listened to somebody. So I'd sort of try and trace it back. So you get all the way back to like the turn of the century with people like James P. Johnson, Albert Ammons, and Pete Johnson, boogie woogie piano players, jump stuff. Those are primary things. Ellington. Just. My father used to say there are only two kinds of music: good music and bad music. So that leaves a pretty wide spectrum, doesn't it?
Why don't you play this track and set up by Warren Bernhardt? And I listened to Richard Bell and listened to Felinicity by Warren Bernhardt.
What's the name of it?
Felinicity, like Felinicity, on Smooth Jazz 105.9.
Hi, this is Richard Bell, and you're going to listen to a song by a great pianist, Warren Bernhardt, called Felinicity. On Smooth Jazz 105.9.
You're listening to Spectrum? Oh yeah, I do it all. Now that we're talking about jazz, Garth came from a jazz background, didn't he, originally?
I thought he came from a funeral parlor myself. That's where the legend is where he learned to play organ. I think, speaking about Garth, I guess to me he's like a consummate musician. He's very humble. He's continually learning. You were asking about influences. I couldn't even begin to think of all the influences in his life. One thing I would say that is very prevalent in his stylistics would be hymns from the Anglican Church. And I think in the early band recordings, one of the things that they really revolutionized was, without getting too technical, what they call pedaling. In other words, prior to them, people would play like an E and an A chord. And what they popularized was by making the bass player play different bottom notes against those chords. It's, I think, something now in 1998 that people just take for granted, but prior to their arrival on the musical scene, nobody did that. I mean, a little bit in gospel, but not very much. So I would say his first influence, and actually it's rather presumptuous of myself, you might want to ask him, but I would think that like the hymnaries from, Presbyterian, Anglican Church and such. And from horn types, he's very 1940s, like, and Duke Ellington, Ben Webster, Fathead Newman. And I'm trying to remember that fellow that he's really... Clifford Scott, he's very strong on. He's a great... I find myself very privileged to be around his company. I've learned so much from him.
Jimmy, what about you? Who were your influences growing up?
Well, a lot. Well, from the beginning, I guess you'd have to say Scotty Moore got me into it with Elvis, his guitar playing, when I first heard, from Hound Dog on. And then Chuck Berry. I mean, this is when I was young, 5 or 6 and 7. That got me addicted to rock and roll. And then it went on from there, from Chuck Berry into, of course, the blues guys like B.B. King, Freddie King, and the English rockers, Eric Clapton. But mostly what influenced me was the people that came into town. Since we live here in the country, I never really saw any concerts until I was almost 16, 17 years old. But I always saw great musicians playing locally around here. I mean, I'd go sit outside of the Espresso Cafe instead of getting in, because I was too young, and I would watch Buzzy Featon, who was maybe a couple years older than me, playing with Paul Butterfield, who was a big influence on his attack and his style of playing. And then I'd go down the other block, and there'd be John Hall, who's a few years older than me, and his pick and fingers and you go see this other guy, Teddy Spilios, who's, I don't know whatever happened to him, but a monster player. Might have been from D.C.
He had a band called Kangaroo.
There you go. He played with John Hall. And I used to sit and watch him. He played a black Les Paul, and he had an attack and a finger and picking thing that was amazing, guitar players. And I could tell I knew that something was coming out of D.C., and there was a lot of great musicians that would play here, and Paul Butterfield's harp playing was a big influence on me. The way just his approach and his attack, and so was Dave Sanborn's horn playing. And because they were always playing in town and jamming, and then again, like I said, Buzzy. And then once I finally heard, I always liked the Steve Croppers and all those players, but and James Burton on the Ricky Nelson show. So I could just go on about Telecaster players, but those were my big influences, and I think just from the local people here that had their impact on me.
And I guess you could say that you did live out your dreams because you had Scotty Moore up here. You had Elvis's band up here not too long ago.
I actually got to, me and Richard and Randy, we all recorded a song with Keith Richards, and I got to sit in a circle with Keith Richards, Scotty Moore, and me playing. And Paul Burleson was jamming with us too, but the three of us cut a track on Scotty's and DJ's new record. So and then we went out and did a show with them in Austin, and did a show with Paul Burleson, who was also the rock and roll trio. I produced a record on him that me and Richard and Randy played on in the band, and we actually got to back up both those acts, and it was just an amazing night. Scotty said, all right, kick off Mystery Train, do it instrumentally, and it's like 3,000 people out there, and no rehearsal. We just started doing it, and then he started jamming, and all of a sudden I realized, hey, I'm up here with Scotty Moore playing Mystery Train with a guy who influenced me from the beginning when I was 5. You know, it was pretty amazing.
Guy who brought the train down the tracks originally.
That's true.
How was it for you, Rich?
Well, I'd say I really enjoyed, if you're talking the Austin job, I enjoyed it a great deal. Of course, I've always considered having 4 or 5 guitar players in a room very close to like an Edgar Allan Poe horror story, because all they do is talk about strings and stuff. But I guess it's the same if you have a bunch of keyboard players. The sessions with Paul and Scotty were a pleasure. Keith was great. He has such a great attitude. And the Austin show, it's one, I guess down the road you have particular shows that stick in your memory, and that one will stick in my mind. I don't think we could do anything wrong that night. It was nothing. You could play the wrong note and it would fit. It was just one of those magic nights.
That has to make it worth it.
Yeah, it really was. It was great.
With us this morning, Jim Weider and Richard Bell from the band, and we're talking about their work over the past 30 years or so. And we're here in Woodstock, New York, up in the Catskill Mountains. And speaking of guitarists, here on Smooth Jazz, we play people like Doc Powell, Norman Brown, and there's a female guitarist by the name of Joyce Cooling out of San Francisco. Have you ever heard of her?
No, I haven't. No.
Norman was like the first guy I saw about Motown, Smooth Jazz. Doc Powell was in Luther Vandross's band.
Okay.
He just set up the record and we'll mix in one room. See what I'm saying? Say hi, this is Jim Weider. Right now we're going to listen to Doc Powell, We'll Make It Last. We'll Make It Last on Smooth Jazz 105.
All right, this is Jim Weider, and we're going to listen to Doc Powell, a tune called We'll Make It Last on Smooth Jazz 105.9.
You're listening to Spectrum on 105.9 WJZW. With us this morning, Richard Bell and Jim Weider from the band, and we're here in Woodstock, New York, and they're talking about their work. You played at the Tinker Street Cafe last weekend, and it was kind of like old home week. I mean, you had your brand new band out there. You made a few changes. Let's talk about that.
It was fun. We had to break in this new bass player, John Ostman, and it really went well. We had missed Richard. Richard had a prior engagement backing up Muddy Waters' son, actually up in Canada, and so we kind of winged it because we needed to. We got some shows coming up next weekend in the Boston area, so we went in there and the whole town came out. Jimmy Vivino came in from Conan O'Brien and sat in, and some good friends of ours from Woodstock, Tom Pacheco and Gizmo, and we had quite a time. The Outsider.
I heard about that show.
It was a lot of fun, and we had a keyboard player that sat in from Manhattan named Becca Byron, who's got her own record coming out, and
I understand she was quite attractive.
she looked a little bit better than Richard, in her 20s.
I thought he was going to replace me with a one-armed bandit, but of course.
Joke, I was at the Woodstock dump, and I found a little lantern. I started rubbing on it, and I started thinking about Richard on the tour bus after 13 years, and rubbed on the lantern, looked at Becca, looked at Rich, Becca.
Well, it's good at least he didn't try and put out the gossip that I'd had a sex change operation.
Richard, every time you turn on the radio and Janis Joplin's Me and Bobby McGee comes on, is there any part in there that you would like to change, or how does that make you feel when that song comes on?
Well, I wish. No, that's a toughie. You could ask Jim or ask some other people. I find a lot of people that I know who have recorded over the years that they're really not crazy about listening to what they've done, because of course every time you always think, well, I could have done this or that, but that particular song I believe was the first take, and it was just a jam, so it doesn't bother me that much. I don't know, but the spirit really flies through that song, and I recently happened to see a little movie on that band where they were showing it on Janis, and I saw some of the footage of that band, and after all these years, it was a darn good band. Very tight, very tight, and very complimentary to all Janis's actions, because we worked off a lot of her physical movements, and it was. In retrospect, I'm really proud to be. Am I boring you? I'm very proud to be associated and have played in that band. And in fact, I just saw Kenny Pearson, the organist, because we had two keyboards. I just saw him last week, and it's good to know he's as nuts as ever. But we had a great time. A bunch of great guys.
What's ahead for Jim Weider and the Honky Tonk Gurus?
Well, we're heading up to Boston next weekend, and then we're going to go up and we're going to headline a Maximum Blues Festival in Quebec, and play our way up through Canada, and then we're going to come back and be playing around the areas, So we're looking forward to touring all fall. So we'll hopefully be down your way soon.
Well, hopefully we'll see you in D.C. Who's in the band?
It's Richard Bell on keyboards and vocals, and Randy Cerlante on drums and vocals, and a guy named John Osman on bass and vocals, and me. Done.
You're listening to Spectrum on 105.9 WJZW, Woodbridge, Washington. Our guests this morning have been Richard Bell and Jim Weider from Jim Weider and the Honky Tonk Gurus, and we've been talking about their work over the past 30-some years. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on Spectrum this morning.
Thank you very much. Jimmy, could you pass me my walker, please?
I think it's hooked onto mine in the back of the car, Rich, but Thomas, thank you, and look forward to seeing you down there.
Thank you, Thomas.
Bye-bye.
I understand, before you go, the band has a new record coming out?
The band has a new record coming out in September on River North Records, and we'll see what happens. We're ready to rock.
Good luck with it.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Thomas.